Good evening, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. My name is Lauren Glinton, and I'm a volunteer here at Equality Bahamas. And it's my pleasure to be joined by Megan Walker tonight for a conversation about femicide and the importance of language when it comes to advocating for women's protection and freedom from violence. We are on day 12 of our 16 Days of Activism campaign, which is part of a global campaign to call attention to eliminating violence against women and girls. And so we're very happy to have Megan here tonight. Megan is a passionate women's rights advocate. She is the retired executive director of the London Abused Women's Centre in Canada, where she worked for 25 years providing service to women and girls, developing policies, and working with the government on legislative changes to help open opportunities for women and girls. She was at the forefront of advocating for Canada's prostitution legislation, and she has appeared as a witness before numerous legislative committees, including the Parliamentary Justice and Human Rights, Status of Women, Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics Committees, and the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee. Megan is a provincial appointee to the London Police Services Board, where she brings a feminist lens to the work, including the unanimously supported initiative to legislate and define femicide in the Criminal Code of Canada. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Megan.
Thank you. Thank you.
We are really glad to have you as part of this campaign. Every year we try to provide access to folks who normally, wouldn't be able to join our events, but because we offer hybrid events, we get to take advantage of getting perspectives from outside of the Bahamas and learning about things that maybe work in another context that we haven't considered. So it's really great to have you here to tell us more about your work in Canada. So why don't we begin with maybe a bit of an elaboration on that biography that I shared just now. Can you tell us how you came to do this work and why you're so passionate about it?
Well, it's a great question because in Canada today, it is the National Day of Remembrance and Action against Women in Canada. And this is a really important day for me. It is the day where we remember the lives of 14 women engineering students at L'École Polytechnique in Montreal, who were victims of femicide in 1998. It was when a man had not been accepted into the university and hated women because they were making progress that he wasn't able to make. And so he just entered the university and he separated the men from the women, and he started shooting the women. And it was, for me, a horrific day. And at the time I had 2 babies at home, and I was watching the news as all of this was unfolding. And my little girls, it appeared to me, were really going to be in a difficult situation if we didn't take action. And so I made a commitment that day that I would become actively involved in this work, and have continued to do this work even after my retirement, because it is really important to me, particularly around making sure women and girls can find freedom in their lives instead of continuing to be oppressed.
I actually didn't know about that history of the Remembrance Day and the shooting that took place. That's really tragic. And
yeah, it was really horrific. It just still, when I think about it, I'm just horrified. It was just such a deliberate act of femicide. Mm-hmm. And it's never been recognized by our government as femicide. Of course, the government really rarely uses that word. And if they do, it's oftentimes really just tokenism. So it's, I see some people on, the line right now, Jean Sorson and Linda McDonald, who I know well and have worked with, and who are also involved in this. And then in their own city, their own, home of Truro, Nova Scotia, and around that area, there was another mass casualty that occurred. And those women that were murdered then still are not recognized as victims of femicide.
Yeah, our theme actually for this year's campaign is still femicide. So we adopted the theme of femicide back in 2021 when the Center for Women's Global Leadership announced that that was their theme. And, that year marked the 30th anniversary of the 16 Days of Activism campaign. And I think just in the aftermath of COVID, there was a clear increase in gender-based violence. And it was important for all advocates and activists to really call attention to this issue and the importance of naming it. So can you talk a little bit about what femicide is and why you think it's important to name it that?
Well, femicide on a really basic level is about the killing of women and girls because they are women and girls. And we need to recognize that all women are potential victims of violence and femicide for no other reason than the sex they were born. And so this is a really important issue for society to take on, because right now, again, femicide is not named in the Criminal Code of Canada. And in fact, what is interesting about Canada is there's no specific legislation around any of the atrocities committed against women. So women are basically included in all sorts of other things in the criminal code, but there's no mention of women and there's no specific legislation for women. So already we're starting from behind the starting line. And when I think about, Canada and what's going on, and, I've got to really honor the work of Myrna Dawson, because many of the statistics I use are because she has allowed me to use them. And it is her statistics to begin with. But in Canada, during the year 2022, we saw 184 women and girls violently killed, primarily by a man. And the minimum estimate of women and girls who lost their lives to femicide between 2018 and 2022 in Canada is 850. It's phenomenal. And, when we talk about femicide, we need to also talk about hate-motivated crimes, because that's what femicide is. It is a crime committed generally by a man who is filled with hatred towards a woman or women. And yet in Canada, the statistics for 2006 until 2006 to 2020 show that there were no hate-motivated crimes laid as a result of women being victimized because she was a woman. And again, it's outrageous. It's just incredible to me that we live in this country that's, first world country, they call it, where these things are happening every day. It's so common. And of course, we know in Canada that every day and a half, a woman will be killed by a femicidal killing. And these killings have increased year after year. So when we talk about what is in a word, well, words are loaded and words mean things. And I remember when I first started working in this field, male violence against women was referred to as spousal violence. And then as time went on, it later changed and the term became domestic violence or relationship violence. And today, of course, the prominent issues that we face as women are to describe male violence is gender-based violence or IPV or intimate partner violence. So I think what is missing in all of those examples, we don't know who the perpetrator is and who the victim is, because there is no mention of them being male or female or woman or man. So what happens then by extension is it leads individuals to falsely blame women as the murderer, for instance, or falsely blame women as somehow causing this. So that's one example of why naming this issue is so important. It is male violence against women and girls, and that needs to be acknowledged. The primary aggressor or the primary victim in almost all of these cases, at least I think the last stat I read in Canada was around 75% of men are the killers. And so that needs to be acknowledged. And, when we do not name these experiences that women have, society remains the status quo. It just stays the way it is. Nothing changes. And it also contributes to more women and girls being killed through femicide. Women and girls are silenced. They have no voice because they are invisible. They've become invisible, in this male entitled society we have. And further, they are not believed. And so because they're not believed, fewer and fewer women will report. And as I said earlier, like, women and girls just die. They're going to die because we don't acknowledge what's happening to them in their lives. So when we don't name this as femicide, we don't receive appropriate levels of funding to organizations across the country that are trying to make sure every woman has immediate access to service. Because in the eyes of those who are the decision makers and the funders, particularly government organizations, they don't see it as a problem. It's just a few women or whatever that might be. And of course, finally, we need data. We need to make sure we can collect appropriate and accurate data so that we can continue to move forward with our efforts to end male violence against women. And so the ability we have to gather data is significantly reduced when we don't name what we are actually collecting the data for. So it's multiple issues that come to play. And when we are dealing with these issues and we know that every single femicide is preventable, we need to then start listening to the voices of family members who have lost their daughters to femicide and other people, experts in the community, to continue to move forward in naming this as femicide and advocating strenuously that femicide be defined and included in the Criminal Code of Canada.
Yeah, data is certainly a challenge in the Bahamas as well. And I think, to your point, without naming it, it becomes very difficult to collect information, right? The Bahamas actually collects data on homicides every year. And so it feels like we're not really asking for, anything that's different than what's already being done. We're saying, call it what it is and get us the data, because time and again, we often hear here at Equality Bahamas that it's not a real issue. It's an individual issue between those two particular partners. And so, it's very easy for something that is in fact structural violence to be seen as an individual problem and not understood for the epidemic that it is.
I totally agree with you. Totally. That's exactly what's going on around the world.
Yeah. And I know earlier this year, the mayor in London, Ontario, actually tried to get the government to call femicide the epidemic that it is. And you kind of spoke briefly about why that's important. Can you share more here as to why you think the health and safety of women needs a bit more attention when it comes to this?
Well, first of all, to address the mayor of London, we were really pleased that he was able to do that. And we were the third city, I think, that adopted that resolution, that declaration, that femicide be included in the criminal code, but also named as an epidemic, which it is. And so now we've got all across Ontario, almost, we've got communities that have adopted that declaration. We still do not have any response from the Ford government, except they don't want to do it, and that has not changed. So, but we continue to advocate, because what I always feel is that women have a lot of power. It's often men that try to take that power from us, but we have power. And I think we must continue to come together and take action to make sure that all women and girls are safe across the country, but particularly in Ontario, where I am with this action that's taken place. We do need to take care of that. So I want to just mention about homicide. Homicide, of course, is a gender neutral term. So it does not, like the other areas that I discussed earlier, it does not include, when people talk about it, any kind of woman that's been killed through femicide or has attempted killing, things like that. So it's important to understand that it's one thing to call it femicide. It's another to take the appropriate action to end it. And so you spoke earlier about the London Police Services Board, and the London Police Services Board was the first police service that I'm aware of that actually adopted the resolution that we fight to include femicide in the criminal code and define it and change some policies for police so that they could continue to monitor to end it. So that happened in 2022, and I think it was in May 2022. We're almost now back to, another year, 2024 now, so 2 years since was coming up, and nothing's happened. So when I try to bring femicide into the conversation, the administration will say, well, you know what, we're not advocates. Police aren't advocates, so we can't advocate to see this included in the work we do. And when I say things like, well, can you just, start referring it to femicide and media releases and things? No, we really can't do that. And yet, I know in the city of Ottawa, they are using the term femicide regularly. And I also know that police services across the country advocate for lots of things. So recently we had police services advocating to change the catch and release policies that we have, because individuals with criminal activity were being arrested and charged and then released. And so then they were going back out and committing further crimes. They were caught, charged, and released again. So it was a huge effort by police services across this country advocating to end the catch and release programs that were in place. And they were successful. So that happens on one hand, but on the other hand, when it has to do with women's issues, we cannot get them to take action. So this is the quandary. And this is why, for me, words are meaningful. And we can't be using those words if we're not supporting them with actions. And that has been missing in my work with policing. It's been missing in my work historically at the London Abuse Women's Centre. And now that I'm sort of independent and working my own, it continues to be the voice I hear all the time. No, 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 we can't do that. So, we're resilient and we're committed, and we're not going to end, and the actions. But I think it's, people need to understand this is not a quick fix. It's going to take a long time. But I believe we will get there. I believe very strongly that this is the only thing people can believe, and only thing people can support is to talk about femicide and see the actions associated and affiliated with it.
Yeah, we are, I think, even further behind than Canada. So it can be frustrating. And I think especially when we think about all of this kind of advocacy work within the context of human rights law,
Yeah.
because, one challenge that we have in the Bahamas is, persons just not knowing that the government has an obligation to actually protect and uphold our rights, and that gender-based violence, femicide, and any sort of abuse or assault is a violation of our rights.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what the general consensus is among community members about, calling for femicide to be included in the criminal code? Like, what are civilians, or persons who maybe don't identify as advocates but are just generally members of the community? What do they think about this?
So that's a great question, because when I first proposed to the London Police Services Board that there be, action taken with respect to femicide, we did do a study. So we went out and did, it was not official, of course, and we didn't go to thousands of people, but we did reach out to community organizations and those that were involved with women's issues to ask for their views. And that included like the Center for Research on Violence Against Women and Children in London, and agencies that work to prevent, agencies that work to respond to acts of femicide and trying to save the lives of women through actions. And it was unanimous. Every single person who responded said, yes, we need to name this as femicide. And so that exists. That's information that is out there. That's public information. And yet still here we are. This is 2 years later almost since all of that happened. And I really want to mention that, like, the London Police Services Board is in every way possible the best board I've ever sat on. And it's a progressive board, and people want change, and we've been able to achieve change on that board. But I think sometimes, because the issues around femicide are complex, that there's a lack of understanding about how things go together. I remember one time I asked that we advocate with the public health unit that we have in London that femicide is a public health issue. And in Canada, we've got like, what I think it's, last I looked, was the cost of femicide, the cost of violence against women was $7 billion. So this is a problem. It's an expensive problem. And so you'd think everybody would want to gather around and reduce those expenses by addressing the source of the problem. But again, I was told that, at that point, that what I was talking about with respect to including it as a public health issue was really outside of the criminal justice system issues. But in fact, they all go together. And women who are abused by a man, or women who are victims of femicide, often have relationships with police. Oftentimes they've tried to reach out for help in the past. So these are complex issues, and it's going to take a lot of time for some decision makers, obviously, to come to terms with that and, do the right thing.
There have been, several incidents in the Bahamas where a woman has gone to the police to report that, her current or former partner is stalking her or has threatened her, and that she feels unsafe. And oftentimes she has nowhere to go, because in a country as small as the Bahamas, it's hard to hide, and it's hard to find a place where your abuser might not find you. It's just physically very difficult to do. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that we've been advocating for is for the police to be more involved and to put systems in place that will actually protect women when they make these reports. What are some of those kind of specific responses that you would like to see the London Police Services Board implement to address femicide?
So we do have what they call the domestic violence unit at police services. So they don't necessarily go out and do reports or do interviews with abused women, but they do get all of the information back to the office and they review the charges to make sure they're appropriate. And I think that's fair. And I think that's great. As far as reporting, though, we do know that, the majority of women will never report because they know what's going on in the criminal justice system and the family law system, where there are, basically my recommendation would be that there should all be start over. Get rid of every policy, get rid of all of that and start over, because everything right now is catered towards men. It's a patriarchal system, largely adopted by what was happening in England. It's very dated. And there's not enough recognition of the experiences of women. So as examples, we can see that a woman will come forward. She's engaged with the system. She's given a statement to the police about her partner who's actively harassing her or abusing her. She expresses she's fearful for her life. And we often have a judge that says, okay, we're going to release you, Mr. So-and-so. And the conditions are you have to stay 50 meters away from your wife. So he does stay 50 meters away by going to the 50-meter mark and sitting in a lawn chair and watching her activities either from the distance or as she comes and goes out of her house. So it always seems that the criminal justice system caters to the abuser or the offender rather than protecting the woman. And I have so many examples about that. I mean, we so often have men that have been charged and there's lots of evidence and the woman is still willing to come forward, and it goes to court and there's an agreement made between the Crown Attorney and the individual's lawyer that as long as he gets a peace bond, they will reduce the charge or withdraw the charges. Well, a peace bond is never any better than the piece of paper it's on. That's not going to protect a woman. And so eventually what happens is the woman stops calling. She's just like, they've done nothing for me. I'm not going to invest in that process any further. I'm going to find another way. And sometimes that means she goes underground. Sometimes it means she, moves across the country. And I think we also need to remember that she's not the first individual he's done this to, and she won't be the last. Mm-hmm. So what are we doing then when we're allowing men to get out, forcing women to move across the country to escape them and allowing him to then meet another woman? And I mean, I remember that happened one time in a case just outside of London where a man had murdered a woman and went to court, and he was given the opportunity with a surety to be released from jail and go back to his home, because the judge at the time said, well, this is a family case, and he's dead. Sorry, she's dead now. So the acrimony is no longer in place. Just completely unbelievable. There was no thought given to the fact that he will go on and do this again if you let him out. Just walk around and do your thing. It just is, to me, so indicative of a system that continues to cater to the rights of men while ignoring the rights of women.
It's really important work, but of course it's difficult work to do as well. One thing that came up in a conversation we had earlier in the campaign was that the Bahamas lacks a culture of activism. Mm-hmm. And I think, part of the reason for this is that in the Bahamas, the state is not as I guess, as responsible as it should be when it comes to educating the public about their rights, about crimes that are happening, issues that are happening, that we should be advocating for. And so it's really a challenge to do advocacy work when that culture is not there. Could you talk a little bit about maybe the generation of active, the generations that are involved in this advocacy work? Are you seeing younger people kind of get engaged with women's rights issues and things like that? I'm curious to know what it's like here in Canada.
Well, first of all, from a big picture perspective, sorry, I don't want to lose this thought about the young women, but from a big picture perspective, we are not in Canada, we do not have a culture of advocacy generally. So we have pockets of advocacy, but we would be hard pressed to get the members of the communities across the country out for a major event. It just really doesn't happen here. So, I mean, lots of us have engaged in advocacy, and we continue to do that. I mean, I do that every single day, but I don't do that every single day with a lot of people. I do it with a group, small group, and we make progress. And I always know there's a huge group behind us that believe in what we're doing. But it just never sort of translates into a big show of support. Now, when we did the prostitution legislation in Canada, there was a lot of support for us. And on the other side, not a whole lot of support for us. But it was a good show of support by abolitionists who wanted prostitution to be legislated. And so that was a big success for us. As for young women, I find I was always disappointed. I used to feel like, oh, young women are engaging, but I have seen over the last several years a huge uptick in the number of young women that are engaging. And they're volunteering in various agencies. I continue to get calls on an ongoing basis here asking me about places they could go and qualify for volunteerism. And so that gives me hope, and when you have hope, you have drive and you want to continue and move on. And I feel that's what happens. I went to the, what was it called now, that after Trump was elected, they had the big event where everybody went, with their pink hats on and everything, and can't think of the name now, but it was the most glorious thing. It was so incredible. Yes, the Women's March. Thank you so much. Linda's just sent me the Women's March on Washington. And it was phenomenal. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of people there. And we walked together and we sang together and we had our, signs together. And it was very, very powerful. And I'm not suggesting that happen, every day in communities across Canada, but I would love it if we had the opportunity for that. I mean, I've tried to get people to protest in the courts, dressed in women's suffragette dresses or something like that. And we have a big protest at the courts because of, the lack of justice for women, but it's hard to get people together.
Yeah. I think for us in the Bahamas as well, it's really a lack of awareness that these things are even issues.
Right.
Because our educational systems are based on, the British educational systems that were passed on to us during colonization. And that kind of educational system really focuses on regurgitation, memorization of information, not really critical thinking. So growing up, even in high school, I didn't really have the opportunity to think critically about an issue and understand, the root of it and the ways in which it might be connected to another issue and how systems and structures perpetuate violence or perpetuate racism or perpetuate sexism. I just didn't even have those kinds of conversations until I got to university. I do think that the younger generation, they have way more access to information than many of us did at this age. But I do wonder too if there is a general feeling of being overwhelmed by the many different issues to advocate for, right? And persons maybe not realizing that they're all related, and that, to your earlier point, these systems really just need to be undone.
Yes.
And, like, completely undone, rebuilt. Yeah, so that's not really a question, but more of a comment.
But I agree with you, and it is interesting. We also have British ties. That's where I learned about everything, was through the British way of learning. And I was not at the, and I was not a good student. I didn't want to learn that way. I wanted to learn through experience, not by being made to sit down and memorize words every night for a dictation. But there was no room for that kind of thinking. There's no room for people that thought in different ways than just that linear thinking. But, I do believe that it's hard for people to gather, and it's hard for people to gather when the work is so hard. So, we are talking about like the most horrendous acts of torture and violence that women face and experience, and their survival. And I think it is very difficult for some people, particularly young people who have never been exposed to that, to hear that, knowing we don't have the appropriate supports on the other side to help them, go through that. And I know my own experiences as an advocate. When I left the London Abused Women's Center, somebody said to me, "You need to leave, Megan, because if you don't, it's going to kill you." And that is true. That's how I felt. I was very traumatized, when you leave that work, because you somehow find pockets to tuck it all away in while you're doing it. But when you leave, it's this explosion of issues. So I am really, I understand why people wouldn't want to engage, but I think we need to do better about finding a way for them to engage. I know that I'm not sure if it's appropriate, but Jean Sorson and Lynn McDonald are on the call right now, and they are experts in non-state torture and can speak about this issue and how difficult it is for people to report, because it's so oftentimes who's going to believe them. I remember one time, and Jean and Linda can speak to this better than I can, but I do remember one time where a woman brought a videotape into the office, and she had been tortured and hung in a building and all sorts of terrible things. And they had videotaped it, and she was able to escape, and she ran away with the videotape and brought it into me, and wanted me to watch it with her. And so I did. And it was the most horrific thing I've ever seen. And I had two thoughts. And the first thought was, this woman is a survivor. Like, how do you endure that and find a way into an office in London, Ontario, because she wanted somebody to know that it had happened, someone to believe her. But boy, it was hard, and it's hard to expose people to that sort of trauma. And yet it's important, as we say about naming things, it's important to name this. This is non-state torture, and it is happening in communities across the country, and it needs to be named.
I want to read Jean's comment in the chat. She said, "Often when Linda and I talk about non-state torture, victimization of women and girls, and non-fatal strangulation as an MO of these perpetrators, Canadians want to think that this does not happen in Canada, only somewhere else. So indeed, not much sociocultural political activism."
Mm-hmm. It's the truth. That is exactly it. There really isn't, people don't want to hear it. I remember, and again, Jean and Linda have had this experience many times, but going and to meet with politicians, and I start to sit down and tell them what's happened, and I start to explain the level of violence and harassment and torture that these women have faced, and they are always like, no, 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 don't talk about that, no, no. And so one time I just went in and I was giving evidence before the Justice and Human Rights Committee in Ottawa. And I thought, you know what, they need to hear this. And I started speaking. They wanted to cancel me. And I said, no, I'm here to speak, and I'm going to speak about this. And then we got through to the end, and it was just silence, no questions. What happened was one of the MPs actually commented and said, this is horrific, and how do we allow this to go on? And then 2 days later, he was found to be having, online relationships with women, where he was discussing acts of torture and things like that. So who do you trust? I mean, can we really trust people to, it's interesting you want to engage men, because men are the problem, not women. And we need to make men, get them involved so they can take action. But it's hard to involve men, because so often you do, and then you hear from their wives or their partners or others that they are abusers, and that place that woman at risk every day. So it is very difficult. And I do believe overall the majority of men are really good and supportive, and I've seen that every day. But I also know that the majority of abusers and torturers are men.
There was an interesting response that Dawn Lavelle Harvard shared with us when we had a chat with her for a previous campaign, where she said that, one solution to kind of separating women from their abusers is to get the abusers in the shelters, instead of removing, them and their kids and their family from the house. But instead making the men go to shelters, because there they can be monitored, they can be tracked, and that way, kids and survivors don't have to be taken away from their environments.
Well, yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
So it's an interesting point, and it's been raised here in London as well. And the difficulty is, of course, you can't monitor individuals. It's a human rights issue. If there's no charges, they may be abusers that haven't been charged. Women haven't disclosed it to anybody at police services or things like that. And so you can't hold people like that. So basically, it's a situation where the woman is back in the house with the children. The man is in a shelter, but he can come and go. And so it actually, in my opinion, creates a more unsafe situation for that woman.
That's interesting.
It is, I think we have to think of everything. Right. Every solution has to be considered. And eventually, eventually we find the solution. It may take us a long time, and we may not be alive by the time the solution has been formulated. But, oftentimes the best solutions are made up of all of the input. So you take bits and pieces from everybody, and you're able to then find a better solution. But I've had some issues with that specifically, and I've spoken publicly about that in the past. That like shelters, you cannot lock people in. The goal is to lock people out. So where do women go then when he's out, like he has a right to be out, and comes to the house and stalks her in the bushes and things like that, and places her at real risk of femicide because he's threatened to do that. So where does she go? There's no shelter because they're filled with men.
Yeah. But I thank you for sharing that, because I think it is important to get different perspectives, and like you said, to think about everything, because you can think that something is a solution, And then when you sit down and consider, well, what does this really mean, and how do we actually achieve this? Then you might identify that, okay, this may not be as much of a solution as I thought it was.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And that's why I think it is so important for us to work collaboratively, because I know I can call my colleagues and, allies and say, listen, I was thinking of this. What do you think? And oftentimes I will speak to survivors about ideas around women's issues, whether it be prostitution, torture, generalized, what we call generalized, maybe violence against women, that is sort of more standard or what we hear about. But I always try to seek input, because I have a strong voice and I want people to hear my voice, but I don't want to be heard if I'm delivering the wrong message. Yeah. So it's interesting around, a lot of things are covered in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. And, they may be enshrined in the Charter, but they're often not given any consideration. And so, for instance, there's not to be any discrimination against anybody because of sex or gender or whatever it might be. And yet that harassment and discrimination is part of women's lives. I was at an event last night, and there was a man who'd had too much to drink who came up to me and was, trying to hug me. And I'm like, no, get away from me. Like, this is inappropriate. And yet I know that doesn't happen to men. It's almost as if men believe they have a right to do whatever they want to women. And that's a very sad reflection. And again, I want to say, because it looks like there's men on this call, that I don't believe it's happening. I don't believe all men are like that. But how do I know? How do I know which man is like that and which man isn't? And and if we're going to try to end male violence against women, we need to be sure about who we're working with, so that we are not affiliating ourselves with women's abusers. I think that's just really an important point. I just know that what we have in Canada looks great on paper, but when you are a woman living in a home where you have absolutely no rights, and you have to ask permission to go to the bathroom, and you have to ask permission to do all these things, or where you are booby trapped in your house, so your partner takes the car to go to work, and he sets up a booby trap with a piece of paper in the doorway, so if you open the door to leave, it'll fall out and he'll know you've left. These are the women I'm talking about. So, like, how do we even help women when we are relying upon the victims, those very women, to testify when they're so terrified to do so? Like, why do we have a system that it's up to women to testify instead of saying, well, it's the responsibility of men to testify, and we will make a judgment accordingly. He will be cross-examined. And I think the reason I think that's important is that if we do not have a system in place where all women are entitled to safety in a courtroom, then we really have a worse system than you could ever imagine. And oftentimes we rely too heavily on women's testimony instead of the wrongdoing of men.
And one of the things we've talked about, particularly in the last few years under this theme of femicide, is the fact that, survivors of violence are constantly being re-traumatized. So I feel like that's something to keep in mind as well when we're thinking of what are possible solutions that minimize the trauma, because it's already very traumatic to have gone through it, to try and report it, whether successfully or not, right? Trying to get people to understand what happened and to believe you. That's enough trauma for a lifetime to try and heal from. And so, these are really important things to keep in mind. And I just want to read again, Linda and Jean's comments in the chat. Many women in Canada have much privilege and don't seem to care about women that are being tortured in families, human trafficking, prostitution, and pornography. They view them as the other. And then Jean says, one firm intervention that she and Linda have is that they do not apologize for speaking the truth about the non-state torture, misogynistic stories, because to do so would mean that we and the women who are speaking or sharing their stories with us are doing something wrong, which they and we are not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. This is a big task to take this on. It's a big task to work towards ending male violence against women. If I can go back to the theme for a moment about words, really words do matter. And it could be my words speaking, it could be a judge, it could be a police officer. And how the message is portrayed to the woman and the information she's provided with or not provided with, oftentimes can lead to femicide or attempted femicide. And so I am always aware of women who go to the police, file the complaint, agree to go to court. She goes to court, and at the first, appearance, he's eyeing her from the other, table, and she knows, if she doesn't win this, she's going to be in big trouble. And then, the next couple of meetings come and go, and the next thing you know, it's been going on for 2 years or more. And she's in a position where the charges are going to be withdrawn. So everybody she knows will think that she's responsible, not him. And she then also is at such a high risk of further violence, torture, and femicide. So we set up a system we have set up a system in this country that again makes it possible for men to kill women, because the criminal justice system fails women so significantly that they either sometimes are killed by their partners or they die by suicide. And we need to remember that. And we need to remember that if we're working with women or speaking with women, we need to make sure she knows all of the consequences of her reporting. Because if she's going to make a decision to pursue things through the courts, she needs to know what she's going to face in doing so.
Thank you, Megan. And thank you, Jean and Linda, as well,
Yeah.
for your comments and for being here with us tonight. I want to just read a definition of femicide that we got from the Center for Women's Global Leadership back in 2021.
Yeah.
And then, share any final remarks.
Okay.
So the term femicide has been defined, interpreted, and applied in different contexts. According to the World Health Organization, femicide is generally understood to involve intentional murder of women because they are women, but broader definitions include any killings of women or girls. Former Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its causes and consequences, Rashida Manju, identified different categories of femicide, which may be active or direct, with defined perpetrators, or passive or indirect. The direct categories include killings as a result of intimate partner violence, also called IPV, sorcery, witchcraft-related killings, honor-related killings, armed conflict-related killings, dowry-related killings, gender identity and sexual orientation-related killings, and ethnic and indigenous identity-related killings. The indirect includes deaths due to poorly conducted or clandestine abortions, maternal mortality, deaths from harmful practices, deaths linked to human trafficking, drug dealing, organized crimes, and gang-related activities, the death of girls or women from simple neglect through starvation or ill treatment, and deliberate acts or omissions by the state. And one thing that did come up in our conversations with the Center for Women's Global Leadership back in 2021 was femicide suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that suicides as a result of feeling unsafe, of experiencing violence, should also be counted as femicide. So Megan, I just wanted to ask you for any final remarks that you may have. And Gina and Linda, feel free to share as well. We're happy to have you here in conversation.
Oh, that's so great. I think that's could be very helpful to have their input. As far as me, I just want to say that I've always taken an approach with women's issues, which is really a three-prong approach. So I always have tried to come at the issues based on the need for fully funded services for agencies providing support, public awareness and education. And the third issue for me would be legislation. And I think if we're not at that place yet where we can really incorporate all three. People talk about it, but it doesn't happen. And when you incorporate all three, you have the opportunity for training opportunities outside of just the community, but into police officers and things like that. And I know from my experience that if you have a police officer who comes to your home and says, I'm here to investigate the torture you're going through or whatever it might be, if that torture is not legislated, that police officer doesn't have the tools he or she needs to lay a charge. And so we need to always keep in mind that if the goal is to hold perpetrators accountable and keep women safe, we need to make sure that we have the opportunity to do so based on those three prongs. And I know right now, the amount of money given to any organization in this city and in this country is woefully poor. And, you know, so many times organizations are spending all of their time trying to raise money to provide services instead of actually working on new policies and new developments to make sure women are safe. So I really am a strong and firm believer in those three prongs. And I know that those three prongs, when they come together, we can find solutions.
Thank you, Megan. Jean has shared a final comment in the chat. Another reality we have learned over the past 30 years, working to support women who survive violence, specifically non-state torture, is that they had pleasure in the dehumanization of having totalitarian control over life and death of those they victimize, so meaning abusers, and remember that this pleasure includes their ability to torture, rape.
Yeah.
I wanted to say, I was going to have it ready and then something else came up, but there's a new femicide report out.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe Jean, you have it there. Can you put it in the chat? I looked everywhere for it and it's got data, global data. It shows how it's on the rise. And I just wanted to say that, you know, non-state torture and femicide are intimately connected because often women that are murdered, they have the brutality of torture, non-state torture, or torture by the everyday person before they're murdered. So they're link crimes, strangulation, non-state torture, and often strangulation is part of non-state torture, and then femicide. And that the good thing is that there's more and more recording of femicide around the world. We're not having any luck in Canada, but the data is growing, and the UN has developed a framework around that. And Rashida Manjoo, the quote that you quoted, Jean and I are friends with Rashida, and she was instrumental in that as well. She's a great woman. So we do know that even though it's a slow process, it is coming. you know, and naming is everything, just like you said, what's in a word, naming is everything. We will never, it'll be invisibilized until, and men do reject it. I mean, in our community, men told us on our town council and one woman that they don't believe that women are killed because of that they're women. They believe that men just snap. So we're dealing with that old patriarchy. Doesn't matter where you live, Bahamas or Canada, or, you know, the patriarchy is alive and well, tragically. And we're dealing with the backlash, the backlash violence, because we've made such strides. And so we need to take pride in that as feminists, that we are making a difference. And we will succeed at this. I mean, the very fact that we're having a global conversation about it shows that it's coming. You know, it's not ever as quick as we want. And too many women are gonna, and girls, because little girls are murdered too. Like little Kiara in Canada was murdered by her father because she was a little girl. So it's never quick enough, but we won't go back. So I just wanna, you know, forever forward.
Yeah, I love that. And I also love that you say about we don't have a choice, because, or what did you say there about choice? You said something about choice, and I thought, well, we don't have a choice. We have to move forward.
That's right.
You know, we have to continue to move forward.
Did you find that, Jean? Did you find? If you didn't, if you want to give us your email, we can email you the report after.
I put it in the chat.
You did? I don't see it.
You know?
No.
So there's a fellow Dylan who's put up, yes, the patriarchy is pretty intense here in the 242. What is the 242?
That's the Bahamas area code.
Okay, I see. Okay, because that's great. Like, I mean, it is a worldwide issue, of course, patriarchy and misogyny. And people sometimes say to me, you know, it's not enough for me. Like equality is another issue, right? Women will say, well, I don't want to be equal to him. I want to be free. You know, and there is a difference between equality and freedom. And I think we need to also think about that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I think it's always important to, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, get these global perspectives and understand where we're at. It's a good way for us to reflect in terms of the progress or the lack of progress in the Bahamas, to hear about, you know, what's happening elsewhere. And, you know, it's unfortunate that not that much more progress has been made in Canada, but we're always comforted to know that there's a community of advocates and activists that are regularly doing this work, such as yourselves. And we just thank you for your time and your willingness to share your experience and your insights with us tonight.
I see Simone there.
Yeah, I was going to say
that many women in prostitution are murdered. The incidence of femicide and prostitution is very high, and to ever think that it's work is ludicrous. That torture is never work, and that prostitution includes torture and femicide. So that's always intimate in my knowing.
Well, I really appreciate being here. So thank you for having me. And I appreciate always being with Jean and Linda and Simone. And I really recognize and understand your input, Dylan, and appreciate it very much. And as I said earlier, I don't believe all men are bad. What I believe is that the majority of abusers are men. And so there is a difference there for me. And like many others, I also have, you know, a beautiful husband and beautiful grandsons and also granddaughters. And I see it, you know, when you have children that you see every day or grandchildren, you do see the impact patriarchy is having even on them at a young age. But this has been a really important discussion. And I hope, you know, you'll continue on discussing these things. And what you're doing in the Bahamas, I think, is just incredible. You know, and it's just nice to be part of dialogue with you today. So for me, thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you, Megan.
Yeah.
So we do have 2 more events scheduled in our 16 days of activism. We have a yoga nidra session tomorrow on Zoom, which is part of our efforts to ensure that we center community care, because this kind of work, is difficult, and we want to make sure that we're also taking care of ourselves. So we have that session scheduled for tomorrow at 6 Eastern Standard Time. And then on Sunday, we have another conversation that we hope you will join us for if you are tuning into the Facebook Live, or here at Zoom if you're available. And that final conversation is actually about the crisis in Gaza. So we will be speaking with a Palestinian queer women's rights activist. Her name is Palestine Zwikat. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but you can register for that conversation at tiny.cc/16days23G, and that's happening this Sunday at 3 p.m. You can check our Instagram and our Facebook for more information. And just thank you for tuning into our work, and stay up to date with us on social media. Thank you, Megan. Thank
you all so much. And thank you to you. Like, it's just amazing to be part of this. So thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Yeah. Bye-bye.